Good evening. In his first party conference speech as leader, Boris Johnson has unveiled his plans to strike a Brexit deal with the European Union with just 2 weeks to the crucial EU summit in Brussels. The Prime Minister claimed that the UK had compromised and he called on the EU to do the same. So let's look at some of the main elements of his Brexit offer. The main changes relate to Northern Ireland. It would stay in the EU single market for all goods, and that would mean accepting its rules and standards. But Northern Ireland would leave the customs union, and that would result in new customs checks, a highly controversial idea which has already been rejected in principle by the EU. And all of this would depend on a future vote by the Northern Ireland Assembly, which is currently suspended. We start with this report by our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg.
70 days into office, a man in a hurry. A matter of hours, perhaps, before he'll know and we'll know if he has a chance of getting a different deal with the EU. If he ought to be nervous, it didn't show. The darling of this hall for years, now their Prime Minister. Leader here, but with no control of Parliament. No way of predicting what will come next. His first target, with humour, less hostility. Politics itself.
If Parliament were a reality TV show, then the whole lot of us, I'm afraid, would have been voted out of the jungle by now. But at least we'd have had the consolation of watching the Speaker being forced to eat a kangaroo testicle.
With friends and family laughing along, Labour's position of holding another referendum on the EU was next.
A second referendum on the EU. I mean, can you imagine another 3 years of this? But that is the Corbyn agenda. Stay in the EU beyond October the 31st, paying £1 billion a month for the privilege.
He's determined to get us out of the EU. But how, when there's so much hostility?
This is not an anti-European country. We are European. We love Europe. I love Europe anyway. Today in Brussels, we are tabling what I believe are constructive and reasonable proposals, which provide a compromise for both sides. We will, under no circumstances, have checks at or near the border in Northern Ireland. We will allow the UK, whole and entire, to withdraw from the EU with control over our own trade policy from the start. Yes, this is a compromise by the UK, and I hope very much that our friends understand that and compromise in their turn.
In a letter to Jean-Claude Juncker, the Prime Minister's laid out what he describes as a fair and reasonable compromise, spelling out a replacement for the controversial backstop, the guarantee against a hard border in Ireland, promising solutions compatible with the Good Friday Agreement to protect the peace process. The plan would create an all-island regulatory zone where goods and agriculture in Northern Ireland would follow EU rules. But the Northern Ireland Assembly would have to vote to approve that plan, and every 4 years afterwards. There would have to be some new customs checks, but carried out electronically or on business premises. No new customs posts, and there's a commitment never to introduce checks at the border. But the vital response from Ireland? Wait and see. But will all that be lost in translation? A guarded response from the EU. Angela Merkel said, "We'll examine the proposals closely, but it's important the EU stick together." And even if they say yes, would MPs vote it through?
It's worse than Theresa May's deal. I can't see it getting the support that he thinks it will get, and it will take us into a regime in Britain of deregulation.
Although crucially, the Tories' Northern Irish allies seem to be on board.
We believe that this is a serious and sensible way forward to have engagement with the European Union in a way that allows us all in the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, and therefore we will be supporting this plan.
But if those talks can't get going, if the proposals have no chance with the EU, then Boris Johnson would have no hesitation taking us out of the European Union without a deal, even though Parliament has changed the law to try to stop him. This crowd would push him to do it somehow.
Then let us be in no doubt conference of what the alternative is. The alternative is no deal. And that is not an outcome we want. It is not an outcome we seek at all. But let me tell you, my friends, it is an outcome for which we are ready. Are we ready for it? Yes, we are. Are we determined to resolve this? Yes, we are.
Ironically, for Brexit's chief cheerleader, his wish is to stop talking about our departure from the EU and move on.
We are about to take another giant step, to do something no one thought we could do, to reboot our politics, to relaunch ourselves into the world, and to dedicate ourselves again to the simple proposition that we are here to serve the democratic will of the British people. And conference, let's get Brexit done and let's bring this country together. Thank you very much.
Both of those goals, so much easier said than done.
Boris Johnson has, after years, found his coveted place on the platform leading his party. But how long he may be able to stay there depends not on the show of faith from this crowd, but on a leap of faith, perhaps, in Brussels.
I thought his speech was superb, Laura. Absolutely spot on.
It was brilliant. It was so funny and inspiring and uplifting.
No more paralysis, no more stagnation. Let's get Brexit done.
You're the Brexit secretary. You're going to get this deal done?
Well, we're working very hard on it. We've put forward serious proposals, and I think both sides want a deal.
But wanting is not the same as getting. This is a Prime Minister and a party who want Brexit to be done, but who simply cannot know right now what they're walking into next.
Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Manchester.
Well, ever since negotiations with the EU began, it's been clear that what happens to the border between Northern Ireland and the EU after Brexit is the sticking point. It's quite a complicated and hugely controversial issue. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, has been looking at the detail, and John joins me now.
Huw, so the Prime Minister's finally hatched a plan, and the question now is to see, will it fly? A plan for the UK to leave as one and still keep the Irish border open when it becomes an EU border. So the aim is to get from this UK and Ireland part of the customs union, no trade tariffs, border taxes, and inside the single market with the same rules and standards on goods. So no checks needed, to this. The UK leaves the EU with a free trade agreement by 2021 with no trade tariffs, though some say it's bound to take longer. But how? Well, the Johnson offer is that Britain, the mainland, leaves the customs union and the single market free to strike outside trade deals where it can and set new standards for goods if it wants, though that would mean checks and form filling and could affect access to European markets. But here's the big sticking point. Northern Ireland leaves the customs union too. The DUP insist on that. They see it as a test of UK membership. So there'd have to be some customs control with the Republic just to collect taxes due on goods from outside the UK and the EU. Now, Ireland says any border checks or control posts would disrupt the peace settlement called the Good Friday Agreement, perhaps lead to fresh security fears, and the EU says the same. The British suggestion of checks away from the border, online, just a few physical inspections, is seen in Brussels as wide open to smuggling, and that's not the only problem. The Johnson offer keeps Northern Ireland in the single market for, and this is new, all goods, not just food and agricultural products. Same rules and regulations on all sides, in other words. But that obviously means there'd be checks on goods from the British mainland to Northern Ireland, which could cross into the Republic and the EU. Well, the DU seem OK with that. But what about the EU? There'd be no border checks. Brussels is worried about its rules and standards being ignored. And Boris Johnson says, for the sake of democracy and the Union, the Northern Ireland Assembly must approve before any new system kicks in during the transition period and every 4 years afterwards. So not the permanent guarantee that Brussels wants. Well, if you think the plan's complicated, just look at the politics. No clear sign that the EU is ready to sign up. Parliament has to agree to any deal. If there is one, no deal, and Mr Johnson is left chasing strongly Brexiteer votes. And a Brexit extension would mean a blame game between Brussels, Downing Street and Parliament, and then a wholly unpredictable election. But then tonight, no one, Huw, can predict anything with any confidence at all.
John, many thanks again. John Pienaar there for us, our Deputy Political Editor. Let's pick up on some of those points and talk about the reaction from political leaders to today's offer made by Boris Johnson. And in a moment, I'll talk to our Europe Editor, Katya Adler. Katya's in Brussels tonight. But first, Emma Vardy, our Ireland correspondent at Stormont. And Emma, we heard there from John about the role being proposed for the Assembly there at Stormont. But of course, it's been suspended for a long time. So how does that fit into this plan?
You're right, it hasn't been sitting for more than 2.5 years, and because of that and a number of other reasons, there's been a pretty gloomy reaction from the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar. Tonight he said that he doesn't believe the proposals meet the objectives for keeping the Irish border open and help to protect the peace process long term. The idea of any new customs checks on goods crossing the Irish land border was something that Dublin wanted to completely avoid, and there's been similar criticism from Sinn Féin and nationalist communities around Northern Ireland who wanted to see Northern Ireland keep a much closer relationship with the EU than it appears these proposals will allow. In contrast, though, it does appear Boris Johnson has seemed to have got Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party on side. They previously despised the old agreements made by Theresa May, fearing it would carve up the UK. But the offer to allow the Northern Ireland Assembly the ability to vote to agree to follow EU rules seems to have done enough to reassure the DUP that their position in the UK isn't being undermined. Of course, the Assembly's not sitting at the moment and no immediate sign of it coming back.
Emma, many thanks once again. Emma Vardy there. Let's go to Brussels and talk to Katya Adler, our Europe Editor. Well, the call was clear from Boris Johnson, Katya. He wants compromise from the EU because he says he's compromising. Are you detecting a desire there to compromise more than maybe they have done already?
Well, first, EU leaders really want to digest this proposal, and many of them feared before they saw it that it would show that the Prime Minister is focused on a domestic audience, on an upcoming general election, and not on engaging with the EU. But I have spoken to a number of EU diplomats tonight who say that some of those proposals were a lot better, they said, than expected, although they emphasise that very big differences remain between the two sides. The EU has a number of concerns when it comes to the Prime Minister's offer, and the European Commission says before it can think of compromise, it has a number of detailed questions for the government when it's properly digested the paper. And now the main concern for the EU, the big flashing red light, comes down to customs. It fears that the Prime Minister's offer could pose a threat to the Northern Ireland peace process and also leave the single market exposed after Brexit. Two big no-nos for the EU. So they want to have very clear answers from the Prime Minister on that. But looking forward, they have to come to agreement and unanimity amongst themselves. Any idea in the UK that EU leaders will now turn to Ireland and say, you need to compromise here because we want a deal with the UK, is not one that we are hearing, neither behind the scenes nor in public. Angela Merkel said that EU leaders will decide on this proposal together and that EU unanimity is extremely important going forward.
Katya, once again, many thanks. Katya Adler there for us and Emma Vardy at Stormont.